So yeah, and by the way, I want to thank our videographer for the last couple of weeks, and last year was Charlie Blaney. So I always forget to thank him. By the way, thanks everybody. Tonight is the second in the series of our four-part Large Pelagics Research Center Fisheries Seminar Series. And as you know, we always try to seek the top people working in the field of fish and fisheries, doing cutting-edge science. And so tonight, we're particularly, let me see if I can get this right. I'm going to introduce Vince in a second, but I wanted to first recognize the loss of our good friend John, it's not John Caldwell, oh my goodness, sorry, John Crunden, otherwise known as the Chief. He was captain of a longliner, the Eagle Eye, and John was the chief on the White Dove too, and he basically was one of the nicest guys there. He was a URI marine science grad. He was a very generous person, shared his knowledge with myself and my grad students, and he died suddenly on Sunday, and so we definitely mourn his loss, and we'll keep him in our memory. So this is for crud tonight. And then I want to remind you that there's two more speakers. That next week is Dr. John Hoey, who is really cool, amazingly experienced fisheries scientist and oceanographer that will be here. He's also a NOAA scientist from the Narragansett Northeast Fisheries Science Center. And John Hoey, if some of you were at the Mayor's Summit, you'll know that he's an amazing, really engaging speaker, and he'll talk about cooperative research. So, and then Dr. Gareth Lawson is our last speaker, and he's going to be talking about creel and the importance to New England fisheries. So two more, so please keep coming out. And so I really appreciate it. So now I would like to give you a little bit of background on Dr. Vince Saba. Vince and I actually share a couple things. One is Philadelphia. Vince did his bachelor's and his master's of science at Drexel University in Philly. Go Philly! And also did his PhD at the Virginia Institute of Marine Science, College of William and Mary. And we also shared a supervisor, Jack Music. And I also want to point out that our program manager, Emily Chandler, where is Emily, was also a VIMS grad. So we've got a lot in common. Vince we're really, really pleased to have him here. Vince, I think, is one of those rare people. He's one of the sort of the new scientists in fisheries and oceanography that studies biophysical interactions of the ocean system and animals. And Vince has worked for many years on sea turtles, and I think his insights, he's got the chops of a really top oceanographer and modeler, but he also really knows animals, particularly the sea turtles. And he's applying his insights from both the biological and the physical realm to solve what we think are some really, really tough questions, and how the ocean's changing system, climate changing system, may impact distribution of marine animals. So I'm sorry to go on so long, but we are really, really pleased to have Vince here. So I'll turn it over.
So the trick will not be to trip on this thing, right?
Oh, and you guys give your titles.
Okay. No worries. Okay. All right. Okay. So we have other talk up there, right? All right.
And I'll just point out if
okay.
Just check yourself.
Okay, folks. Thanks for coming. First of all, I appreciate it. It's my first time in Gloucester. Beautiful place. Love it up here. So the way I'll do this talk, if you have any quick questions that you might want to ask while I have a slide up, feel free to raise your hand in case you forget it later on or whatever. And sometimes I've tried to make this available to a general audience and understandable. So I'm not going to make it too long or drone on either. But what I want to do is first kind of discuss, before I get into the turtle stuff, what I do for NOAA. So I'm purely research. I don't do any management for National Marine Fisheries Service. So if there's any fishermen out there, please don't yell at me. I'm purely research. My three main research topics that I do for NMFS are protected species ecology, which mostly includes sea turtles, loggerheads, and leatherbacks, particularly from Hatteras to Gulf of Maine, out to the shelf and shelf break. I also do phytoplankton ecology, particularly looking at climate and how the climate affects the microscopic algae that are in the ocean, which of course feed everything in the ocean. And typically, the type of data that I use for phytoplankton come from satellites. So the satellites measure large portions of the ocean, basically the color of the ocean, and I relate how the color of the ocean changes in relation to changes in climate, both climate change and also natural variability. And then in terms of climate itself, I'm actually based in Princeton at a lab called the NOAA Geophysical Fluid Dynamics Laboratory, where NOAA designs their own climate models, which they use to project the effects of climate change forward 100 to 300 years. So we use these models for fisheries and sea turtles as well. So since we're here in Gloucester, I figured I'd show this slide. This is the observed ocean temperature change over the past 110 years. And what this is showing, basically you can ignore the scale there, but where you see these red areas, these red areas are where the most substantial warming has occurred. Okay? And if you look at our region here, the U.S. Northeast Shelf, you can see it's an area of red. So you compare this to the other NOAA NMFS management regions, Alaska, California, Gulf of Mexico, and the South Atlantic Bight, and even around the Hawaiian Islands. Here's where your most substantial warming has occurred. And you know, in terms of what we think is the major cause, we think it's a combination of both climate change but also the natural climate signal working together. But as I'm sure most of you know here, last year, 2012, was in fact the warmest on record. That goes back to the 1860s. So just to kind of put 2012 in perspective, I put this slide together which shows the observed sea surface temperature average over the Northeast Shelf. So again, this is from Gulf of Maine to Hatteras out to the shelf break. Averaged for 2012. The black line is the observed temperature starting in around 1900. And this is kind of smooth, so you don't really see a lot of the variability. And then the red line comes from the NOAA GFDL climate model. So what you can see is that 2012 was not only, you know, the warmest on record compared to this black line here, so this is the observed, but if you look at the climate model's projection up to the year 2100, you can see that the mean conditions that was experienced here in 2012 aren't expected to occur here until the year 2050 or so, in terms of every year you'll experience a year like 2012. That's how warm last year was. Now this year is not shaping up to be as warm as 2012 was, but still, this last year we had might give us some perspective as to what things could look like 40, 50 years from now on a year-to-year basis. So when you guys see these models of climate change, when you see the classic hockey stick curve, if you folks have seen Al Gore's movies or just, you know, lots of news stories showing this general trend of increased temperature, these projections come from climate models. You have to be able to simulate the entire Earth's climate, both the oceans, the ice, the land, and couple them together to make these projections. So these models are very, very complex. They're modeling the atmosphere, the oceans, land, and now we have these models called Earth system models. They take it one step further and they incorporate land use, so changes in vegetation, deforestation, and they also measure ocean phytoplankton. So we're looking at changes in algae as in relation to changes in climate as well, which of course is important for fisheries. And basically everything that lives in the ocean that eats, which is everything. So just to give you an idea of where these models are at now, so this is a model I'm going to show real quick, a demonstration of how this model simulates this region. This is a very high resolution model, so when I say it's high res, in other words, it's able to simulate dynamics on a very small spatial scale. So this here is about a 10-kilometer spatial scale, more or less. So this is going to be a brief movie to show this model simulating the Gulf Stream and kind of put in perspective the size of New York City and how this model simulates ocean circulation. So there's New York City. So it's about 0.1 by 0.1 degrees longitude, latitude on average. Each little square is a grid cell where the model's computing. And this is the simulation. So this is sea surface temperature. You can see the Gulf Stream, the Labrador Current. So these types of models can be used to run forward with the changing climate. And you know, a lot of species here are affected by changes in the Gulf Stream, changes in the Labrador Current, changes in circulation, salinity. And these models can simulate that, not only in the historical area, like where we are today, but also project them forward. But you need these higher resolution models to get these currents like the Gulf Stream, these larger lower resolution models can't resolve the Gulf Stream all that well. So these new prototype models are doing a pretty good job. Okay, so on the sea turtles. So sea turtles basically have this generalized life history cycle. It applies to all 7 species. Some folks argue 8, but it's basically 7 general species. The reptiles, they have to lay their eggs on a dry substrate. So sea turtles lay eggs on sandy beaches. The eggs stay dry. They're laid about maybe somewhere between 1 and 3 feet below the sand surface. And they incubate anywhere from 40 to 60 days before they come up and hatch as hatchlings, we call them, baby turtles. The females then return back to the ocean, sometimes between a week or 2 weeks, come back to the nesting beach again to lay more eggs. And they'll do that 3 or 4 times in a single nesting season. Then they go out into the deeper ocean waters, the pelagic areas, where they forage, and they might not come back for anywhere from 2 to 10 years to do that whole nesting process again. And it's also assumed that breeding occurs right by the nesting beaches. So the males will come back every year, whereas the females might come back every 2 to 10 years. So this interval in between nesting years, which is called the remigration interval, we found that with almost all the sea turtle populations we've looked at, that it's the condition of their foraging grounds, where they're eating, that determines that length of time. So when conditions are really good, the climate's good, their food resources are good, they'll come back even sooner to nest again. So in particular, the species that I've looked at, leatherbacks in the Pacific, we found that the El Nino Southern Oscillation is a major driver determining the length of time they're at sea before they come back to nest. So for those of you who are not familiar with leatherbacks, they're among the largest reptiles in the world, only next to Nile crocodiles, which are bigger, a little bit bigger. They have a unique soft leathery shell as opposed to your typical hard shell turtles. It's almost like a skin. And they have really fast growth rates. They grow faster than any other sea turtle. And they're quite fast for a reptile, which you think, cold-blooded, they have slow metabolism. These guys can really heat up. We think they mature somewhere between 14 and 20 years. Some of the estimates now are about 16 years. Some might argue even longer than 20 years in terms of when they're ready to produce eggs. They're very deep divers, down to up to 1,000 meters, but that's not their typical dives. Those are rare dives, but they can go that deep. This gigantothermy, the fact that they're large animals, they can maintain consistent warm body temperatures, and they think this is a similar adaptation that dinosaurs had. Their large size, even though they were technically cold-blooded, because they were big, they could maintain a warm body core. So these leatherbacks can be seen swimming around floating ice in the Gulf of St. Lawrence. It's definitely been documented before. So they can tolerate very cold temperatures, whereas other sea turtles would go into a cold stun, like a loggerhead or a Kemp's Ridley. Now, these turtles, when they nest, they require tropical incubation. So all the nesting beaches are typically along the equatorial belt. So the eggs need to be at very warm temperatures, although the adults can survive in very cold temperatures. The hatching success, which is the number of hatchlings that actually come out from the eggs and make it to the surface, it's considered pretty low. It's only about 50%. So if a turtle lays 100 eggs, only 50 of those eggs will actually hatch into hatchlings. Typically, turtles are about 90%. So leatherbacks have a very low hatching success compared to other species of sea turtles. And finally, the sex ratios of the hatchlings are determined by the temperature at which the eggs incubate at. So warmer temperatures in the nests in the beach produce more females. Cooler temperatures produce more males. And they have a very unique diet. So these are, again, some of the largest reptiles in the world, yet they eat almost exclusively jellyfish, which are 95% water. So you think an animal this big that has to eat something that's mostly water has to eat a lot of jellyfish. And this is especially true for these females that have to not only build enough fat reserves to make that migration to and from nesting beaches, but also produce all of those eggs and do it over and over again in a single nesting season. So they need lots of jellyfish. Okay, so where are these turtles nesting at around the world? So this is a figure showing ocean color. As I mentioned before, it's a way of looking at phytoplankton growth in the ocean. So these green areas are where you get lots of phytoplankton, basically the grasslands of the ocean. And then here I have pointed out all the various major leatherback nesting beaches around the world. So let's start here in the Atlantic. The turtles that you're seeing up here, so if you folks have seen Cara Dodge's talk, these turtles are typically nesting in the Caribbean. They're nesting off of Trinidad, St. Croix, Virgin Islands, French Guiana and Suriname, and Costa Rica, and also Panama, some of the major nesting beaches here. Nice thing about sea turtles, at least relative to fish, is that you can easily count their populations by going to nesting beaches and counting females. You take that as an indicator of how many turtles are actually out there. So when there's been changes in the population, you would think that you would see changes in the number of females coming back to nest each year. So what we're finding that in the Atlantic is that these populations seem to be either stable or they've been increasing over the past decade or so. And again, this is simply just counting females on the nesting beaches. If we look at the eastern Atlantic, this population is mostly nesting in Gabon, Africa. And these turtles, which I'll show in the next slide or two, are mostly limited to the South Atlantic. We don't see these turtles coming up north across the equator. The turtles nesting here in the Caribbean are not going below the equator. They're mostly staying in the northern hemisphere. Okay, the turtles nesting here in South Africa, they're mostly staying here in the Indian Ocean, although some do come across into the South Atlantic. And that population is also stable or increasing. So throughout the Atlantic and the southern Indian Ocean, the populations appear to be stable or increasing based on female nesting counts. Now moving to the West Pacific, this is Malaysia, Indonesia, Papua New Guinea. These turtles are showing declining trends. In fact, they've been almost completely wiped out in Malaysia. And that was mostly due to females coming up to nest and they were being harvested. Also, the eggs are being harvested as well. So when you harvest both the females and the eggs, eventually you're going to get no turtles coming back. And that's, in fact, what's happened in Malaysia. In the Eastern Pacific, this will be the population I'll be mostly talking about today. Their beaches are in Mexico and in Costa Rica, and these populations have also shown a dramatic decline over the past 20 years. And I'll show a figure in just one second. So on these nesting beaches, turtles are measured. This is French Guiana in Suriname. They're measured, they're tagged, they're scanned so we can see when females come back, which females are coming back, and how many. The eggs are counted. The hatchlings are typically counted. Temperature measurements are taken. This is where satellite tags are put on. So where you see Cara Dodge putting them on in water, these females are getting tagged while they're nesting. Then they go out to sea, and we have this what we call post-nesting migration from the nesting beaches. And these turtles, it's a very arduous nesting process. They dig with their rear flippers to dig the nest. It's about maybe 2 feet down below the surface, 2.5 feet. They dig until their flipper can't reach the bottom, and then they start to lay the eggs. And they basically go into labor for about 10, 15 minutes. They lay their eggs, then they start to cover up and head back out to the ocean. The whole process takes about 1 hour. And these turtles are nesting in the daytime, but the ones in Costa Rica, which I'll be talking about in the Pacific, are nesting at nighttime. And then the hatchlings, basically, when they come out 2 months later, make this huge scurry for the ocean as fast as they can. And so we've estimated that about 87% of these turtles, once they emerge from the nest, actually make it to the ocean. The rest are eaten by night herons, ghost crabs, feral dogs, feral pigs, cats, things like that. So you need lots and lots of turtles making it to the ocean, because once they hit the ocean, you can imagine what starts eating them there. They're just basically floating hamburgers, you know. Largemouth bass, sharks, frigate birds, it's a smorgasbord. So that's why most of these hatchlings typically make it to the ocean at nighttime. So what you're seeing here is the exception. Okay, so where are these post-nesting females going? So this is a figure showing almost all of, not all of the post-nesting female tracks, but most of the tracks that we have to date. And what you can see is that in the Atlantic, let's look at this region here. These turtles that are nesting in South America and the Caribbean, they're all coming up north, okay? So the turtles you're seeing here off Gloucester, in the Gulf of Maine, off Nantucket Shoals, those turtles are nesting in St. Kitts, Trinidad, and they're making their way up here to forage in the summer and fall, and then heading back down south again when the wintertime comes to either lay eggs. For juveniles, they hang out there and then come back up again to forage again. If you look at turtles nesting in the Eastern Pacific, we see something a little bit different. So if you look at the blue circle here, you can kind of see turtles heading from South America to coastlines, but they're also hitting the pelagic areas, well, the deeper waters. You look at these turtles nesting in Mexico and Costa Rica, they're kind of staying out in deeper water. We don't see a lot of coastal migration, so just keep that in mind when I show some of these next figures. In terms of the other populations, we see typical foraging or migration of a wide-ranging turtle, such as leatherback. They're crossing the Atlantic. In fact, these turtles nesting here in Indonesia in the West Pacific cross the entire Pacific to the coastline of California and Oregon and northern Canada to forage on these large sea nettle jellyfish. And this, I believe, is one of the largest, if among the largest migrations for an air-breathing marine animal. crossing the entire Pacific to get there. It takes over a year to get there. Okay, so let's look at the population trends in Costa Rica. So this is the west coast of Costa Rica, the Eastern Pacific population. In the late 1980s, early 90s, they estimated about 1,500 nesting females in a given year. Today, we're getting no more than about 30 or 40 females. So there's been a precipitous decline from the late 80s, early 90s to present. And we think the major culprit is historic egg poaching. Poachers would come out to the beaches, take almost 100% of the eggs, and what we think we're seeing today is a result of that. There's not enough hatchlings entering the ocean, and now we're not getting enough adults coming back. The other culprit we think are these artisanal, unmonitored gillnet fisheries off the coast of Peru and the coast of Panama. And what we think is happening there is these turtles, there's been lots of reports showing large females, large males, and juveniles getting caught in the gillnets and essentially drowning. So we don't think the long lines are a major problem for these turtles. We think it's really these artisanal, unregulated gillnet fisheries that might be knocking them off. But not all of them die. We think it's about maybe a 50% mortality rate among the gillnet fisheries off Peru. But we think the major culprit at this point is likely the egg poaching. So these turtles have, because these turtles are, have drastically declined so much, they've been heavily studied. And when I say heavily studied, I mean they've been heavily studied in this population. So we've even looked at climate, and we've looked at effects of climate both on the nesting beach and also in the ocean. So what we found was that when you have these El Nino Southern Oscillation shifts, so when you have this La Nina period, which is these blue regions here, the Eastern Pacific is colder than average. And you see these effects here in Gloucester where you see either higher or lower snowfall, changes in rainfall patterns. The El Nino signal is observed worldwide. Well, in the Eastern Pacific, when things warm up, we get these El Nino periods. And what we found was that on the nesting beach, when we have these La Ninas, nesting seasons that follow a strong La Nina, a cold period, we get more turtles coming in the nest because there's more food in the ocean from these La Ninas being more productive. We're also getting more hatchlings produced because things are cooler. So these nests are now cooler, and they're producing more hatchlings because the warm sand tends to cook the hatchlings if it's too warm. So the cooler the sand, the more hatchlings emerge from the nest. And we're also getting more males produced. And again, in the ocean, the food resources are higher during those La Nina periods. So just to put it into a visual perspective of what an El Nino versus a La Nina looks like in the Eastern Pacific, this is again ocean color showing how much phytoplankton or algae are in the water during an El Nino versus a La Nina period. And what you can see is this is a very strong event, one of the strongest on record, the 97 to 2000 switch. And what you can see is during this 97-98 El Nino, you see lots of blue and not much green, so not much food in the water. Now these guys are eating jellyfish, so the idea is that the more phytoplankton in the water, which have to feed on things like zooplankton, and even some salps can feed directly on phytoplankton, the more jellyfish you have, because it's essentially the food web, the bottom of the food chain is increasing, so their prey then goes up, and there's more food for leatherbacks. And this is the region they're foraging in. And during La Nina, you have very good conditions for leatherbacks in terms of their food. It's more productive. So if we look at, again, the Atlantic turtles, the ones that you guys observe here versus these Eastern Pacific turtles, we also show differences in their size. So the Atlantic turtles, they're bigger and they're producing more eggs. Typically larger reptiles do produce more eggs, they're more fecund. But the reason for it, we think, is because you see this diverse foraging strategy where you see females going all over the Atlantic. They're going to coastlines. Coastlines are typically the most productive. That's where most of the food's at. Lots of nutrients, there's upwelling in the eastern boundary regions of oceans. These Eastern Pacific turtles are mostly staying in this unproductive gyre, and we think that's why these turtles are so much smaller than those in the Atlantic. So these ones in the Atlantic are producing more eggs as well. So when you saw those graphs, those figures showing most of the Atlantic turtles are basically not changing so much in terms of their population, we think that they're a little bit more susceptible to environmental and anthropogenic or human influences on their mortality, because they're bigger turtles and they're producing more eggs. So they can maybe withstand a bit more outside negative influence than these Eastern Pacific turtles, which are smaller and not producing as many eggs. And I should also add that the Atlantic turtles are nesting more frequently. It's about every 2 to 2.5 years, whereas the ones in the Pacific, it's about every 3.5 to 4 years. So it's less eggs and they're not nesting as often. So in terms of the nesting beach, we can actually predict what the amount of hatchlings that come up from the nest on an average in a given nesting season based on the local climate in Costa Rica. And what we found was that when we have these rainy, cool conditions from La Niñas, the black line here is the observed number of hatchlings that come up in a given year. So you can see here that when you have, in 2005, we had 65% hatching success, which is considered above average for these turtles. But you also get the emergence rate. The emergence rate is essentially, of those hatchlings that have cracked the shell open and they're under the nest, how many actually come up, okay? So that surface sand is really much more closer in contact with the surface air temperature, and that can really heat up when things are hot. Whereas the bottom of the nest can be a little bit more insulated from what's happening with the air temperature and the rainfall. So we found that these La Nina periods, we can use the ENSO index, which is the measure of these swings in El Niños and La Niñas, to predict what the hatching success and emergence rate will actually be. And we found it to be quite variable, that you have this, these really big swings in how many hatchlings are coming up. So just to kind of summarize this visually, so during El Niños you have very low food resources in the ocean. The nesting beaches are warmer and drier, so you're getting fewer females coming in the nest, but you're also getting fewer hatchlings and less males coming up as well. And we think this is a female-dominated population. So it's important to have these pulses of males into the ocean to keep up with recruitment, to make sure enough females are breeding and there's enough males in the population. And just during La Niñas, you get just the opposite. More females, more hatchlings, cooler conditions. So the objective here was to take what we know, this climate sensitivity of these turtles, look at these global climate models that we have and kind of merge them together and force the population over the next 100 years to see how changing rainfall, changing air temperature, changing ocean conditions will impact the population. So we designed this extensive population model, which I won't bore you guys with all the details. But what you should know is that it was basically forced with ocean conditions and also nesting beach conditions. So that's the one unique thing about turtles, is that you have to look at both environments. You can't just look at one or the other. So if we look at what the trends are for this region, Central America, just like the rest of the globe, is projected to become warmer over the next 100 years. And essentially, the increase by the year 2100 is about a 4.5 degree Fahrenheit increase in air temperature by 2100. That's on average. And you can see these black dots here are all the different leatherback nesting beaches. Here's the Playa Grande nesting beach in Costa Rica in the farther south, Mexiquillo, which is in central Mexico. And essentially, if you look at the projected temperature, which is this panel here, by 2100, you see lots of red. So basically, all the nesting beaches in East Pacific are projected to get warmer, which was no surprise. Now let's look at rainfall. So here's the observed rainfall on the left panel for these 4 nesting beaches in the Eastern Pacific. And here's the projected change. And all you need to know is that these blue areas are projecting a decrease in rainfall, and the red and yellow areas are projecting an increase in rainfall over the next 100 years. And what you can see is that all these nesting beaches are projected to receive less rainfall by the year 2100. So they're going to become not only warmer, but also drier. And if you remember, that's not a good thing in terms of how many hatchlings are going to come up from the nests. Okay, and in terms of the ocean, when we have this model that projects how much phytoplankton will be available for jellyfish and zooplankton, which the turtles are feeding on, we found that when we project forward, we don't see much of a change in the amount of phytoplankton. And that's this green line here. So you look at these swings with these La Niñas and El Nino periods, but overall, we don't see any major change in their foraging resources. Again, this is a single model, which is of course available to uncertainty, but it's considered a pretty well-tested, good model. So what I'm going to show you is basically the population model from the period of 1900 to 2000, and then it's going to project forward with about 7 climate models forcing it. And you'll see what the female population is doing up to 2100. So what you'll see here on the left, the y-axis, is the number of nesting females, and then on the x-axis you have the year. So if we run this through climate change, what you can see is that you get about a 7% per decade decline in the nesting population. And that all these basically spaghetti plots here, this is based, all these different color lines are different climate models. But what you can focus in on is this black solid line, essentially just, gradually declining down to the year 2100. So what's causing this? Is it the ocean or is it the nesting beach? So what we did, we let certain conditions change and certain conditions not change. So in this simulation here, we said, let's let the ocean not change at all, okay? We'll keep that what it is today, no influence of climate change, just let the nesting beach change. When we do that, and the ocean stays the same as it is today, we still get that 7% per 10-year decline. Now let's just change the ocean, and we won't change the nesting beach conditions. So we're going to keep the same temperatures and same rainfall as today, and then project forward with just the ocean changing. When we do that, we get somewhat stability. So this black line here basically remains stable, and there's not much of a population change over the next 100 years. So that tells us it's the nesting beach that's driving that decline. So what is it in the nesting beach driving that decline? Well, if we don't change rainfall and just let air temperature change, we get the decline again. So that tells us that air temperature has got to be the culprit, not the decrease in rainfall. So here's no change in air temperature. We get no change in the population. It remains stable. And this makes sense in terms of, essentially what's happening in that upper layer of sand. If you're warming the air by 4 or 5 degrees Fahrenheit on average, you're going to really cook that upper layer of sand. When those hatchlings are coming up, they basically fry. And there's no shade on this nesting beach. It's basically just beach and dry tropical forest. There's no construction, there's no development, it's a protected area. So in some sense, we felt a little worried about this, but then we realized, well, this could be something that we can easily fix, which I'm going to show in just 1 minute. The last part is that when we look at both the emergence rate and hatching success, both of these have a major driver in the decline. So both the number of eggs that are hatching and also how many turtles are making that upper layer both affect the decline similarly in terms of the nesting beach influence. So one might say, well, okay, well, if this is happening, what if the turtles nest earlier or later in the year? So maybe they'll nest in the cooler part of the year. What will that do? Will that be some way of compensating for a warming climate? And what we did was we ran the population model forward, assuming the females nest earlier in the year and later. If they nest later in the year, it actually increases the decline because the later the nest, as the nesting season progresses, if we get into about January and February, the nesting season is typically between October and February. If they're nesting later in the January and February months, it's warmer and it's also drier, so it's already not a good thing. If they nest in the earlier part of the season, when it's cooler and more rainfall, it does in fact tend to delay the decline by about 20 years, the progression of it, to about a 5% per decade. So that is one way the females might be able to adapt, although what we're seeing now is that the females are actually nesting later in the season based on the observed data, which might not be the best option. Okay, so what does this mean for the nesting sites? Well, what if these turtles tend to move south or further north? Then what? Well, it already appears that they're already nesting in this band of rainfall here, the ITCZ, which is the Intertropical Convergence Zone. And this band of, we think that they're nesting all in this similar pattern of rainfall because it seems to be the most beneficial for the hatchlings in terms of keeping the nest temperatures stable and also producing enough males. If they go further south toward Panama and Peru, they may experience too much rainfall, these red areas here. If they go north into Baja, Mexico and northern, northwestern Mexico, it's almost like it's basically a desert there. And there's lots of temperature swings and it's also very dry. So we think that the reason why we're seeing these beaches here is because of this consistent band of rainfall. However, if you look at the projection, all these beaches are projected to get drier and they're all projected to get warmer. So we don't see much available for these turtles to go north or south in terms of adapting to a changing climate. We think that humans are going to have to possibly intervene on nesting beaches. And essentially, what we think we can do, I'll just point you right to this bottom bullet, is that we can go in and simply, it sounds kind of funny, but actually shade or irrigate these nests. It's actually very cheap to do. And it's been shown you can actually cool these nests down by simply putting these very cheap shades on top of the sand, and it keeps the nest cool by about 2 to 3 degrees Fahrenheit internally. So to sum up, this warming seems to be, the warming of the nesting beach seems to be the major culprit driving this decline. Not so much changes in the ocean and not so much changes in rainfall. One thing we didn't look at is that because we're getting drier conditions, there was a decrease in the amount of males produced. So it went from about 88% female, which is we think average, to about 92% female. So this change in the number of males, we didn't really account for that, which also may have another negative influence on the population, so less males in the population. But again, the big thing here is that we think that if an observed decline, again, this is a model, but if an observed decline occurs, and they've seen this gradual decline in amount of hatchlings produced with climate change, simply going in, and I'll show you a picture what that looks like. These are these nest corrals which we put on top of the nest in the hatchery, and they're actually meant to keep mosquitoes from going in and nesting. And basically when that happens, the whole nest becomes infected. And we also found they also keep the nest cool. So we're finding when we put these things on nests, they're producing more hatchlings. So this could be a very simple, cheap, cost-effective way of keeping these nests cool as air temperatures are projected to increase, to keep this population, well, it's already declined, but to keep things from changing from the climate. That's the idea. Thank you very much. That's it.
I'm sure Vince will be ready to take questions.
Do the models capture sea level rise, and does that have an effect on the beaches?
It's a great question. So sea level rise is one of the biggest uncertainties in these climate model projections. There's one thing they feel good about, and that is basically when you warm water, you expand it. Okay? So they have what's called thermal expansion, which is you're warming water, and they feel they have a pretty good idea of how much will change with that. The biggest uncertainty is what's going to happen with the Antarctic and Greenland ice sheets. The models are everywhere when it comes to that. Now, on this particular beach, these turtles are nesting on about a 3-foot berm. So they already get they're already about 3 feet above sea level. So if there is a rise, the rise is projected to be about 1.5 to 2 feet by 2100. So we think that there'll still be ample beach to nest on in this particular beach. Now, I'm not sure about the other beaches. The other thing about this beach is that there's no development behind it. It's all basically mangrove and dry tropical forest. So with gradual sea level rise, we would hope that the beach would just basically progress forward or backward toward the land. So, but yeah, we didn't account for sea level rise in this study, mostly because they're already nesting about 3 feet above sea level to begin with. Any other questions, Molly?
First of all, really interesting presentation. And I know there's many layers underneath of the work that you presented.
Yeah, I just didn't want to bore everybody.
Do you mind speculating just for fun based on your knowledge? And in your models, you've looked at the productivity. But what about the particular diet?
Right.
Do you think the models actually do you feel good that the models can tell you about scyphozoan dynamics?
Right.
Or not, in terms of jellyfish?
Right.
Because they specialize in that gelatinous. How do you speculate?
Yeah, so basically, the only thing is these models stop at phytoplankton. The latest model they have now at NOAA GFDL goes up to zooplankton. So, I mean, I don't even think they're getting krill. They're getting basically some of the copepods and things like that. What we're doing is we're saying, okay, if the jellyfish food resources change, then we might see a change in jellyfish. What these models don't do is look at things like bioenergetics. So you have a warmer ocean. You have not only turtles swimming in a warmer ocean, but also jellyfish swimming and eating and metabolizing and reproducing in a warmer ocean. So we don't have explicitly how that would affect leatherback prey, like they eat lots of the smaller lion's mane jelly here. We can only assume what might happen. And from the models right now, in terms of looking at just what they eat, like the phytoplankton, there seems to be this global decline in phytoplankton. Most of the models tend to have this global decline, and that's mostly being influenced what's happening in the subtropics and tropics, because some areas are projected to get even more phytoplankton, like the northern and southern areas. So these turtles, because they're temperate foragers, they're foraging in areas that are typically, colder, subpolar, and subtropical. They might be okay in terms of food. However, we're not too sure on the bioenergetics, like in terms of just being a reptile swimming in warmer water, what that's going to do. But we think that because the nesting beach seems to be so strong that any additional ocean effects might not outweigh what we're seeing on the nesting beach. But yeah, but we're hoping that the models eventually do start simulating things like global jellyfish biomass, but they're just not there yet. They have a lot of issues. So, anybody else have a question? Sir, I'm sorry. I'll give you the next.
I was looking at the view cost review and catching in and I got into this routine where you come down in the morning and see all the tracks going into the water from the nest hatching to the hatch at night, and you dig down and find like another 20 of them.
Right.
So, carry them down to the water, let them go. It's a real good feeling, and must be helping the fish tremendously.
Yeah. So we call those excavations. And we were just down there, my wife and I were just down there a few weeks ago, and we were able to assist on some of those. And that is a way of helping them out as well, to go in there and excavate the nest after it's hatched and pull those stragglers out. A lot of times, unfortunately, some of those stragglers are already weak and they don't have the energy to make it, and they'll probably get swallowed up by a grouper once they get out there because they're not swimming too fast. But that's another way to help out. But I think the shading thing can help as well, because those corrals really do keep those nests cooler. The other thing I thought of was putting sprinklers like you would in your lawn, and just basically right inside a hatchery of sea turtles, and keeping them cool and wet as well is also beneficial. So just having, but of course that's not as cost effective as simply putting you have to use water, so it's and some of the, like Costa Rica, water is always a valuable resource, so it might just be cheaper and more environmentally efficient to use the shading. So, question?
You mentioned, jellyfish obviously do not have very high caloric value
Right.
to them. What sort of intake, how many jellyfish do a leatherback turtle have to eat?
Tons.
Tons?
Wet weight or dry weight? They're just jelly. Yeah, well, so this is interesting. The ones off of California, the ones feeding in Monterey Bay, they're eating the sea nettles, the scyphozoans, and those turtles, so the gonads are up in the top of the bell, and that's the nutrient-rich part of the jellyfish. Those turtles have been observed to just hit the gonads, and they basically punch these holes in the bell of the jellyfish. And what you see when leatherbacks are foraging, you just see lots of floating sea nettles with holes in the middle of them, and they're just eating the gonads, the nutrient-rich part, because they just figured, why focus on the rest of the jelly? Let's go to the energy-rich ones. When I was out with Cara this year, I didn't see that behavior. I saw them just intake, the whole animal was being consumed, the smaller lion's mane jellyfish. So that's an interesting strategy that we think might be exclusive to these western Pacific turtles that are foraging off of California. But they've done estimates to see, I think in the Gulf, yeah, the Gulf of St. Lawrence ones, they've done some estimates, and also you've done some for your first estimates using the hatchlings, right? Looking at metabolism.
We estimated that they would have to eat their biomass per day wet weight in classic and that was
Yeah.
the early days of estimating.
Right. So it's a ton of tons, literally. When I say tons, tons of wet weight jellyfish. Lots. Yeah. But there's lots. Apparently, there's lots out there. Yes, sir.
The slide where you showed the migratory patterns in North Atlantic, that was scattered and completely different
Right.
from the ones in the South Pacific or even South Atlantic.
Right.
Yeah, that.
Right.
So you would think they'd be chasing jellyfish or that might be pushed to the Gulf Stream
Right.
in the east. And yet, what those patterns show is it doesn't look like they're following swarms of jellyfish going up the Gulf Stream. So why would the patterns be so different from different regions?
So we think, so when you see them foraging going to coastlines, that seems logical to us, because coastlines typically are where you have lots of food, right? The ones that are in the South Pacific, Southeast Pacific there, what we think happened is that because of these fisheries off of Peru that are not monitored and they're typically getting caught in the nets, we think that population, that cohort, if you will, those females that were going there, are now a minority in the population. Now what you have left are these pelagic foragers, because if you look at the Atlantic, you do get pelagic foragers, but you also get a mix of coastal foragers as well, going to the coast here, they're going across to Europe, to Africa, but we don't see that so much in the Pacific. So but if you go to Peru and you go to these areas where they're fishing for sharks and rays, there's leatherbacks out there. And when they've done the genetics, they found that these are leatherbacks coming from Mexico and Costa Rica. We just haven't tracked them down there. And we've tracked like 50 females over 3 different years. And we've only seen 1 female go there, yet we know there's leatherbacks there from this population. So what we think is happening is that these ones coming out just have a higher survivorship. But what's interesting, if you look at Trinidad, in the West Atlantic, there's also lots of gillnet fisheries there. And they get turtles coming back with machete cuts in their flippers, because the fishermen typically want to keep their nets, so they'll just hack a flipper off, and they'll come to nest, and there's a lot of them that wash up ashore. However, because these turtles are laying so many eggs, they're nesting more frequently, we think they're a bit more resilient in the Atlantic to things like poaching and these smaller scale unregulated fisheries off the coast using gill nets. But we're not 100% positive. We just think that's why they're a bit more resilient.
Well, if they're spread all over the North Atlantic, right, then it's not going to be that much fishing industry going on in the center of the Atlantic versus off the west coast of South America.
Right. However, but if you're fishing at a nesting beach, it doesn't matter how far they're going. So they're going everywhere. But if you have all your fishing centered along a nesting beach plus egg poaching, it's going to eventually wipe them out. That's what happened in Malaysia. They were getting both the females and the eggs. And those turtles were going everywhere, according to the satellite tracks. So it depends on what type of influence you're talking about. You know, the offshore fisheries, the long lines here, they seem to be mostly foul hook. It's not like these gill net fisheries, which they're actually getting caught. But the main culprit we think here was the egg poaching in Costa Rica. That was we think the main cause of decline. The artisanal fisheries may be secondary to that. So, but yeah, good question. Anybody else? Molly?
You've presented some really interesting, very practical approaches for Costa Rica, West Coast
Mm-hmm.
of Costa Rica. Now I want you to know about this, say, Papua New Guinea or Malaysia rather. If you were in charge of leatherbacks and you had all the money in the world, what can you think? What would you do? Could you do anything? Could humans do anything there? What do you think?
In like the Western Pacific?
Yeah, you talked about mitigation.
Yeah, I mean, you know, it wouldn't take a lot of money to begin with to do the shading component. In terms of the artisanal fisheries, that is, of course, a lot harder to regulate because, I mean, we know that there's a pretty high mortality rate because they're drowning in those gill nets. That is all, they're all happening in places where they don't have enough money to have enforcement and to regulate. So I think one thing I'd like to do, at least I've tried to do to get money for, is to start tracking these turtles that are actually getting caught to see what their seasonal patterns are going off and on shore from Peru to see if they can have some type of marine spatial planning where they know that, okay, turtles are going to be here this time, we have to be careful with the gill net fisheries, but then when they're not there, they can, you know, fish away and not have as much regulation possibly. That could be one way of doing it, but there's just not enough money, so that could be a source for funding. But in places like Papua, you're talking even poor areas there, like fifth world country there, and it's basically those people that have to eat, and you know when they see a turtle nesting, they're gonna, it's easy dinner, and it, you know, can feed probably a quarter of the village. So that's a bit trickier, and you know they're seeing it's a combination of both the egg poaching, but also the harvesting of females. That's not a problem in Costa Rica and Mexico anymore because these are now national parks. They're protected. It's still a problem in the West Pacific, and that's what happened in Malaysia. So, but you know, if you look at the Atlantic, they're doing quite well in the Atlantic. The numbers are high. They seem to be stable, both the eastern and the western Atlantic. Yet you still see mortality. You see mortality among lobster pots. You see it off Trinidad with gill net fisheries. Not so much with long lines, but they seem to be, you know, in terms of what the nesting beaches are doing, fairly well. In the Pacific, they're just declining everywhere. So, we'll see. Any other questions? No? Okay. Thanks, folks.